Commission for Monday, December 3rd to order. We can stand and Aaron, we listen to the Pledge of Allegiance.
Raise your right hand over your heart, repeat with me. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Aaron. At this point, we have a light crowd. Any member of the audience that would like to discuss anything that is not on the agenda this evening is welcome to come forward and state your name and state whatever you'd like to say. Negative? Okay. At this point, request for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, reorder of agenda items, or additions of ex-agenda items. Anybody?
I have nothing.
Nothing? And has everybody gone through the minutes? Are we okay on the minutes?
Yes. Yep.
Like make the motion to approve the minutes from the previous meeting, which was Monday, September 4th.
I so move.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And now at this point we will hear upon discussion of proposed ordinance amendment pertaining to accessory dwelling units and recommendations for further study. Holly, it's all you.
Thank you. I'm Holly Owen, Planning Director, City of Solvang. Thank you for coming tonight. I wanted to let you know that Brenda Messer prepared the staff report, prepared the PowerPoint as part of her advancement desire. She was going to present tonight too, and she is unable to attend due to illness and is very disappointed and said that she'd be very happy to live stream herself in should we have questions. So I just wanted to thank her in advance for preparing all this, and that might be why the delivery might be just a little on the rusty side because she was queued up to do this. So with that, I wanted to let you know, first of all, that I'm very aware that we have had some of these discussions before. The legislature, in their wisdom, makes this a little bit of a moving target. Brenda has made a great effort to field a lot of our conversations and our questions about what is and is not allowed with a couple of resources from Housing and Community Development. They are the ones that will ultimately also review our ordinance for compliance. So the standard for this particular ordinance is a little higher than you would probably find with a typical ordinance that we would consider and then adopt. So with that, I just wanted to run through her PowerPoint and the staff report. It was a fairly lengthy packet. There are a few things to consider, and there are a number of things that we really are not allowed to consider. So I think we've talked about that before in the past. We've had some clarity from the state over time, and often in cases like this, you wait for court cases to decide what you can and can't do. But with that, we have enough ordinances that people have considered in other jurisdictions in past. We have one from SLO we've included just as a local example for you in the table with the columns. So there are a lot of other resources and a lot of other ordinances that are out there. And we feel like what we have at least recommended in terms of the staff recommendation have either been vetted with HCD or meet some of our unique needs too. So the staff recommendation is to review the proposed language amending the ordinance. I think we've had an ordinance for quite a while, but the state action made that null and void when they superseded what we had on the books, and not only our jurisdiction but everybody else in the state. So in May of last year, we did discuss this, and we brought some issues to light. One of them was to bring the item to council and to research water and sewer capacity. Planning staff has met several times with the public works staff to start to discuss in general what our capacity is in terms of water and wastewater. One of the conclusions was that at this time, if we were to build everything possible that's zoned in the city, we wouldn't have enough capacity, especially wastewater capacity, to allow that. That said, there are studies that are lined up to look at our water and wastewater capacity. I think those of you who have been following some of the city council discussions on the wastewater treatment plant know that we are in consideration now of expanding it and changing the type of treatment that we do. Some of that is driven by state law for denitrification, but also that's capacity issues that we're looking at. So we have preliminary estimates that show that we certainly have enough capacity to allow ADUs at this time, and so the challenge with trying to build capacity studies is to know how far out you project, and what we can do in terms of alternative water and wastewater sources. So that is an ongoing and larger term study, and the ADU impact would be considered minimal. So as I said, it's now null and void. We do have some things that are within our purview, however. One of them is a requirement for owner occupancy. We have requirements that we could impose for setbacks. The number of ADUs per lot. There's actually some jurisdictions that have allowed more than one per lot. There's maximum height considerations, design guidelines considerations, and what constitutes a residential zone, and how much do you allow that. So the previous ordinance had mirrored the setbacks that were reflected in the underlying zone district, but we can determine what setbacks would be required for ADUs at this time. But the overall command from Housing and Community Development is that it can't be a burden to developing. In other words, finding a way to allow these is a significant piece of state strategy to provide what they consider to be more affordable housing. Not affordable housing as in what we traditionally think of affordable housing, like low-income housing, but this is more the missing middle housing. And we'll get into a little discussion after a while about the RENA numbers and how these ADUs help us to fulfill a piece of that is required, and that's challenging to meet in any other way, really. So the previous ordinance had a lot size for a detached unit that must be 10,000 square feet, and for attached, 6,000 square feet. We've had a lot of internal conversations about this, and also conversations with HCD about the requirement for lot size. If you look at some of the other ordinances around the state, some have requirements for lot size. Some of them are more of a proportion of lot coverage. We're a little bit unique in the sense that we don't have much language in residential zones that pertains to lot coverage. Some cities do, but for whatever reason, Solvang doesn't. So that may be something we may want to consider, but at this point, I would like to say that we have been tasked with allowing them where possible, and that 10,000 square foot parcel is over the average size for a residential lot in the city of Solvang. So that needs to probably be taken into the larger consideration for that particular determination. We are recommending one ADU per lot. That seems reasonable. One of the issues that might make it challenging to allow more than one ADU per lot is that parking requirements, which we'll get to, parking requirements are pretty much waived. With the way that we are in the city of Solvang, we are always within 1/2 mile of a transit stop because we have on-demand transit. So that limits our ability to require more parking, and it would be my recommendation, staff's recommendation, that more than one ADU per lot would constrain our capacity for, for parking on. We get people that would start to park on the street or in tandem, and it would be reflected in a less than aesthetic outcome, I think, in terms of design guidelines and what that looks like for the larger community. The previous ordinance had a size requirement, size maximum, and the state requirement is 12,000 square feet. That be the maximum. That's I'm sorry, 1,200. Yeah, 12,000. That would be quite an ADU. No, 1,200. So I think we believe that's a big ADU. Again, we get into proportionality. There are a number of ordinances that talk about a certain percentage of the existing primary residence being taken into consideration when you look at a maximum size for the ADU. And I think that's what we would expect in a community such as ours, that we looked for a guideline that would keep that proportionality. Even if we're talking about a small lot, then the primary residence would also be small, given the fact that they're governed by existing setbacks, and the ADU that would be built should be somehow within that proportional framework. So we're looking for some guidelines from that. This seems to be a common understanding of how high an ADU can be. It's assuming also that you can build a second story over a garage, and that is allowed. My concern about that would be that, at least at the administrative review level, that we would be careful about second story windows and how they look over neighbors' properties and that kind of thing. You can certainly make that determination at the staff level to take that into consideration if somebody's building, for instance, over their garage. So that is allowed, though, to have a unit over a garage, and that in some ways has less of an impact in terms of visibility. You still have a little more open space if you choose to go up over your garage, as opposed to a whole second, a second dwelling unit that's accessory dwelling unit that takes another footprint out of your lot size. So apparently our previous ordinance didn't require design guidelines or review. I think that's an oversight. I think that it would be appropriate, especially where visible from the street, to match at least the architectural and aesthetics of the primary structure when possible, or the surrounding neighborhood. Again, this is not a development plan, not a conditional use. There isn't a lot to be done in terms of requiring this for a public hearing, but what we can do is at least require at the staff level that the architecture reflect the larger community or the house, the primary residence that hosts that experience. The previous ordinance allowed it in residential zones. There is a map that's included in your packet that has a general plan, and I asked Brenda for a little clarification before we started the meeting, because I wanted to ask her about her bullet point that said any legal non-conforming single-family residence is allowed to be constructed in any zone. That was a comment from Housing and Community Development. What they were, a good example of that would be, I know of several houses that are zoned in the TRC, but they're single-family residences, and in that situation, they would be allowed to build an accessory dwelling unit because their primary use is they're already a legal single-family residents, but they're not conforming as to the district. So, in other words, you would allow them to build an accessory dwelling unit that's appropriate in terms of size and architecture for that zone. We haven't seen a lot of activity in our ag zones. We do have some. And this does allow ADUs, but I guess it does drive the question: would you build an ADU if you don't even have a primary residence? Probably not. So maybe we'd have to make that pretty clear that I'm thinking of the ag strip that's by Fjord Drive down in the south. I don't think we would want ADUs to be built there, but they would have to be primary.
Well, yeah, there would have to be primary residence with an owner.
Yes.
That's what we decided.
And owner occupancy, which which is one of our next points here. That's a very, I think that is something that we have shown to take pretty seriously in the past. That's a philosophical decision on the part of a jurisdiction. I know of some cities who don't really mind if they have vacation rentals, if they have a lot of their residential housing stock, for instance, turned to vacation rental. So you don't really have an owner occupancy in that situation. Now, for Solvang, we've determined that where we want that we want to keep our residential neighborhoods intact, and to have a recorded covenant that would require at least a family member to live on that property and in that primary residence would keep it from turning over to an entirely rental situation on the property. So I've kind of skipped ahead here, but I think that's one of the points that we have decided is pretty significant to hold fast to. That's a staff recommendation, and certainly it's up for discussion here. So we did touch on the parking a little bit. The parking requirements are probably one of the biggest changes that we've seen to the accessory dwelling unit legislation. The most important point there is really, for us, is number one, we don't really have an architecturally or historically significant historic district, but we do, we really have to say that most of our public transit is within a half mile of most of the residentially zoned area. There would be tandem parking would be allowed. We don't usually allow that, but when it comes to accessory dwelling units, they have determined that is a sufficient and legally allowable arrangement. Parking in the setbacks. I actually think we do allow driveways in the setbacks, so perhaps parking already is allowed in setbacks. But what you see here, long story short, really is what you see is that parking is going to have to be considered on a case-by-case basis, but there's not really a requirement for it that can't be met at this point. Fire sprinklers are not required unless the primary residence already has fire sprinklers. We have asked every ADU application we've received so far to get a separate address, so we've already been doing that. That's just considered a health and safety issue to have a separate address for your ADU. And it's more convenient for renters too to have their own separate address for billing purposes. So for us that's not a big issue, but it's just an informational point for you to know. They would of course have to meet building code requirements. We have some applications that have come in that are now legalizing living units that they've had in the past, and they're required to be brought up to minimum code requirements at this time, and we would continue that. That's pretty much a logical requirement that one would have for anybody living in a dwelling. These are 120 days application process. So we have a back and forth that happens with a plan check and corrections and resubmittals, but that is that's somewhat ambitious. It depends, of course, on the scale of the project. Some of these, again, are already existing. There's already existing buildings, and they just want to make them legitimate. We haven't really had any new construction yet come in, but we anticipate that we will see that in the first quarter of next year. We did talk a bit about what proportional fees were going to be, what they looked like. We're still working that out. We're getting there. That's been an ongoing discussion with City Engineer, Public Works, because the key word there is proportional fees. I think we've had this discussion before about what that might look like, and we continue to investigate what other jurisdictions are doing and what we did in the past. It's pretty clear that what a lot of fees that were charged in the past for this type of use was a discouragement towards considering this for folks. I think it wasn't unusual to see $20,000, $30,000 for impact fees to be charged for an accessory dwelling unit in the past, and I think that the state has stepped in and has made that a little bit a higher bar in terms of trying to defend that. I think Roy probably knows of some case law that may have come out of that, or not yet. We await some of these. But I think that's. But we've been given a direction to show the good faith effort that these are proportional fees. They hopefully will be recovering whatever costs the city will incur with those, but they need to be at a minimum less than what you would charge a a full-on single-family residential house. So we know that, and we're working with our fellow staff to come up with what we think is a fair number to not discourage the development of these. There are other fees that are also assessed, so these are not negotiable. Particularly, the school fees are a given. We have made a determination in land use clearance fees for the time being that we feel that existing square footage is already within a building envelope, and perhaps $500 seems fair. But with new full-on construction, especially detached, we should charge a higher fee for review. A lot of that review will be done in-house, and a fair number of staff hours to prepare documents, to review the plans, and to make sure that we're keeping track and being consistent with the way we review and approve those. So it will not, again, there will be no public hearings involved, but there's still staff time to recover. We did mention a little bit about this owner occupancy recorded covenant. Again, we have done this before. We've done this historically in Solvang. And I will take your direction and your recommendations, but I do think that there was a reason that we talked about vacation rentals in the past and what would be allowed and where. And I believe that this is still the spirit and the intent of the residential properties in Solvang, that we have a recorded covenant that an owner live on site. They don't have to live in the big house. They can live in the little house, and they can rent out the big house, something I might plan to do with my own ADU when I get to be a little older. But that said, there will be someone who's a voter, who's committed to the community, hopefully, and who can keep an eye on what has essentially become a rental within an existing residential neighborhood. I think we all learn about once every 8 to 10 years about the housing element and what RHNA is. You'll hear the word RHNA. I won't drag you through the entire process, which can be pretty arcane. But long story short, there's a number that's given to us with every housing element update for the 8-year periods. It trickles down from the state to what we call our MPOs, which is SBCAG in our case. There's a methodology that's applied, and you see in your staff report, there's some tables that show what our RHNA numbers were for the last time we had that allocated to us. These are not numbers that, again, we are required to build, X units of housing, but we need to show that there is a way, that there are no obstacles to building that. And that means rezoning sometimes, upzoning as we call it. For this particular time frame, in the arc of the housing element cycle, we have met our low income requirement. You see in the table there was a requirement of 42 for a very low income, and we met that with the Solvang Senior Apartments. The above moderate numbers tend to take care of themselves. Those are market rate numbers. So any single family residential that's built in the city of Solvang is undoubtedly above moderate for an above moderate income. The more challenging numbers to meet, the more difficult ones are the moderate housing. For one thing, there's no revenue stream or funding mechanism that's easily obtained to create that kind of housing. There is some talk about workforce housing being certainly has a strong need in the state, and ways to make incentives to drive the market to build housing for school teachers, housing for people who work for the city, and other small business owners. Housing that is considered affordable in our context for moderate housing. One of the ways that these can be met is the allowing of junior accessory dwelling units and accessory dwelling units. The state is still considering. They've given us some guidance as to how to tabulate that, how to count that towards our need. But I see that that's going to continue as a need for us until some mechanism is supported by the state in a financial way, or maybe federal money, to begin to give the developers and builders incentives to build this kind of housing. Until then, ADUs are certainly a great way to make some of those numbers. So with that, that concludes my presentation, Brenda's presentation. She would have been a lot better at it. And I'm here to answer to some of the questions, and hopefully we will get some clarification on some of the recommendations that we had in the staff report. I'm here to facilitate that discussion, and that concludes my staff report.
Okay, at this point, commissioners ask questions. You want to start with Gay?
Yes, thank you. So, I believe you said that only one application has been submitted so far for an ADU.
No, I'm sorry, that was probably something else I may have meant, but no, there have been 5, I believe, that are in the process now, but these are all existing.
Okay.
Yeah, they're all
They're
existing.
as-built. They're
As
applying for
built,
as-built
yes,
permits.
they're as built, and then people have heard that that the law has changed. They want to make sure that they're permitted, not only for for the obvious reasons, but for resale value and that kind of thing. So we probably had a handful, I would say 5.
So 5 in the works and none have been approved yet.
There've been 3 that have been approved.
3 of those as-built. have been
Yes.
approved.
Yeah, at some point we were driven by the clock too, by the 120-day time. So and because if we don't have an ordinance that is legal, it defaults to the state, and those are the guidelines that we've been following. With as much as much direction as we could give to people in terms of connection fees and the garages in that development. Now, he's not turned in plans yet. Well, actually, that's not true. He's turned in some preliminary plans for 2 lots, 2 out of the 8. So those I would anticipate would be some of our first new accessory dwelling units to be built.
So when an ADU is administratively approved then by staff, are the neighbors notified? Is there any notice given so that if there are concerns about things like privacy, will they be able to speak up about it?
There is not at this point a requirement for that, and I'm not sure if we could require it. I think that's more of a legal question. I'd want to consult with the city attorney before we would have to. It would be a radius notice. I'm not aware of anyone that any jurisdiction that does that at this point. That said, I think especially given the relative compact design of a lot of our residential neighborhoods, I would trust that staff would be sensitive to that, especially to what I mentioned, the second-story windows and garages. It is something that I would like to research a little more to see if there's any way in which we can put that in an ordinance where a second story would have to, the privacy.
Amend the ordinance later on then if we wanted to add that.
We could do that.
Amendment.
We could do that later. I don't see anything in the code that specifically forbids us having a notice requirement, but we couldn't change the 120-day
Days.
time clock
Right.
for staff at all. And we would have to make sure if we did draft one that it didn't constitute what the state would consider a burden on development, because that's specifically what they want to do. That's kind of going to be the litmus test for the state on any of our attempts to regulate is, are we creating a burden to try and keep the development from taking place? If they're convinced that's what we're doing, then they're going to try and find whatever avenue we did improper. But I just went, as you asked the question, I went back through the code, and I can't find anything that specifically prohibits a notice procedure. It's not common for ministerial permits to have notices, but there are situations where other ministerial permits are subject to notice to nearby property owners, and in fact appeal if they think the ministerial permit was issued improperly. So
Okay.
we could probably come up with something.
I would appreciate that if you would check on it. And again, I appreciate that we don't want to put a burden on the developer, but we don't want to put a burden on our residents either.
I understand, your desire in that. I think my question from where I would sit in this process would be, we notice neighbors and they come in, what then? You know, the appeal of a, as Roy says, the appeal of a ministerial permit would be to whom? You know, one would hope that someone who is responsive to the community concerns would certainly take their concerns into consideration and make whatever changes, whether they be design changes, you know, anything possible to accommodate, you know, that concern for their quality of life.
Well, I would hope so too. I mean, I don't want to see a bunch of appeals, but I do want to see the neighbors having a chance to say, this isn't going to work for me because your window's overlooking my property, or you're too close, it's going to be really noisy, or, you know, there's a fire hazard here situation, or something like that that, you know, would really require a second look, I think, before it was permitted.
But the fire hazard would be addressed in the permitting process, wouldn't it?
I don't know.
Yeah,
you know,
it actually would have to be. I mean, fire has to sign off on these.
Okay.
They are structures that people inhabit. So,
Yeah, I'd kind of want to forewarn you that I don't think we could come up with a procedure whereby neighbors could essentially have the ability to impose a condition on the construction of an ADU that is not allowed by code. So, for instance, setbacks. And we might have neighbors that feel that the ADU is going to be too close to their house, and it is going to be noisy, and all those normal things that happen with houses. And the code specifically contemplates that we can't regulate that. So basically that we're probably going to be able to allow for notice and comment, but the only grounds upon which someone would be able to appeal the granting of a ministerial permit would be that it shouldn't have been granted because in the first place, right? It wasn't complying with the law as mandated by the state. Not that there were special conditions that should have been added because of the of neighborhood concerns, no matter how rightful the concerns are. This is a one-size-fits-all mandate from the state.
Yeah, then that's the bottom line, it's from the state.
Yes.
But doesn't it, I thought, I read somewhere in here that they're not allowed on some land, constrained land. It has to still meet
yes,
the public health, safety, and welfare.
yes.
Well, is that just a staff determination that it meets that, or is it a neighbor who says to staff, by the way, I live in the neighborhood, I have a say that I think it goes against the health, safety, and welfare, or is that, I don't know.
Yeah.
Determined.
And they don't have to do
I-
a conditional use permit for
No.
every dwelling,
I
so
don't think it can be on
they
a,
don't come before us.
it's not a, I don't think that concept in the state law is meant to be determined on a case-by-case application basis. I think it's more in terms of, basically, you're supposed to allow them everywhere. Unless you can identify
Health,
particular
safety,
zone.
welfare
Right.
concerns.
The
You would
default
find in
is
your zoning
allow.
code that they're not allowed.
Right.
But that would be brought up during the building permit process.
Well, and the
we-
review process.
If we review
the
the
building
ordinance, if, I'm going to make something up that probably doesn't exist here, we might have, if we were in a city that was in a wildland fire area,
Which we are.
but I mean more specifically actually in it. Much of Atascadero is, because it's a lot larger geographically. And so much of it is, although it's a different type of forest, it's kind of like the city of Paradise, where it's abutting the actual forest. Think of Cambria, which is abutting the actual forest. I can see where if you developed the right record, you might be able to say, in these specified areas of the city that in fact do abut the fire hazard, we're not going to allow ADUs in those. If you could get evidence in the record that that created more danger for others as opposed to just subjected an additional house to the danger of the fire. It'd be difficult, but I don't think we're going to be able to craft one that is going to give individual neighbors any veto power over their other neighbors' building of an ADU.
I will also say that just today I read a little news feed about Los Angeles, and they have just very recently, maybe this week, attempted to prohibit ADUs on hillside development, which there's a lot of hillside in Los Angeles, and it just happens to be in some of the wealthier enclaves, which happen to be the hillier ones too. So there's this tussle already going on that may end up in a court case actually about whether or not they will allow they will prohibit ADUs in some of the areas in Los Angeles that.
Well, I would
that are
imagine that
much hillier.
that's a result of some of the fires recently where the fire
Right.
equipment couldn't reach the buildings up on the hillsides.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are areas, and there are probably areas on our periphery here, on our city limits that are up against oak forests and stuff, that might be a place where you wouldn't want to have too much crowding of buildings because that spreads fire.
But behind Friedensburg Canyon, uphill, something like that. Let's go through once and then come back.
Yeah, let me, I'm almost done with my
No, I say, wait, we'll come back and go around
Oh,
again.
one at a
Everybody can make
time?
their main points.
Okay.
And then come back, because I know you have more.
I do.
Aaron, you've got a whole bunch.
more.
No, I honestly don't.
TBDs.
Oh, well, I mean, we're not asked to draft an ordinance tonight.
No.
No, this is just a
this
review.
This is meant.
So-
I mean, if there are things that you're concerned about, this is the time to express the concerns to staff. I mean, the next step will be that a red line ordinance or a draft ordinance will come to Planning Commission. It will not probably be you as planning commissioners,
Right, it's
but
gonna
it
be
will
next
be
spring
the next
sometime,
planning
right.
commission. Yes, it'll be February is my guess. So the new commissioners will be considering this on your recommendation. I think we've talked about this twice now. At
May
least.
7th, we had our first meeting on this.
Yes. So and there was some legislative action in the middle of the year that we had to take into consideration. Also, I'm guessing that we haven't seen the end of it. This is for the legislature. It seems to be an easy way for them to say, doing our best for affordable housing. But the point of translating those grand desires into the on the ground approval process begins with us. So that's what we're working out.
Yeah, and so the only comments I have is the state's going to dictate. I mean, we don't have a lot of choice. State's going to tell us what we can do. I'd like to see, some restrictions that you folks have laid out, and we laid out back in May. I think our minutes from that meeting was, hey, whatever we can do to meet state, but yet keep it as tight as we can so that we don't just duplex the whole city. And by
i.e. Ventura.
duplexing the whole city, you would say an owner has to live there. You would limit your size. You can't limit your square footage of attached. You need to we need to reduce our fees. That's insane. That our fees are so high because it is absolutely makes it prohibitive, which is not good. You can certainly notice your neighbors, but they have no say, so it really doesn't matter other than you notice your neighbor, like with having a building permit up, I suppose, if it's that clear cut. I have a question on the 120 days. That is really 120 days from application to permit or from land use clearance? It's actual
Land use
permit.
clearance. I
Is
believe.
it-
Is that your understanding?
or is
of
it
Roy?
permitting?
I'm thinking it's permit, but let me go back and
Well,
look.
you have a lousy architect who could easily go past 120,
except-
that's a
the
very
time that
subjective
isn't
deal.
counted
We
that
get a
goes back
delayed-
and forth.
We get a stop in the clock.
Yeah.
Every time we send it back.
Yeah.
And the architect sits on it, the clock stops ticking for staff.
The state law says that.
Yeah.
Yes, it
Okay,
does.
so that's good. So that clarifies that. That should be clarified because people are going to think, I'm at 121, I'm suing the city, and yet you didn't do it right. So clarification on that would be
Okay.
good.
Thank you.
The fire sprinklers, obviously, the parking is exactly what the state says it can be. One thing that needs to be ferreted out is when we talk about these connections. if it's an in-house second residential unit, or if it's a detached, there's two things and they get bandied around and confused. One is connection fees and one is actual connections. So I think we're talking connection fees would be eliminated if it's interior because you're using the same systems. Now, if it's a detached on a new, you would charge fees, but you could certainly still tie into the connect into the existing system.
Well,
Do we
that's that larger
understand this?
discussion, yes.
So
we
that
had
needs
it.
to be talked with Public Works. When I chatted with Matt Vanderlinder back in the spring about it, he said, gosh, no, we do not want to see, if he has a perfect world, if I go put a second residential unit on my property and I pay the fees, he certainly doesn't want me digging up the street and going into the sewer main and the water main. Why? You're just adding another bedroom and an X amount of square footage, just like if I had another family room added on with a bedroom for a kid who happened to still live at home, or I just had more babies. Right. He doesn't want the public systems ripped up. And the cost to a developer, an owner, is enormous to rip up a city through a public sidewalk into a public street with all the encroachment permits that come with it.
And would there be 2 water meters?
So then that goes to the next. Would it be 2 water meters? And I don't know why it would be 2 water meters. That seems prohibitive.
I think
to
only
me.
if you wanted to meter it due to passing on those costs to your renter.
Right. But
mean,
again, does it need to be required or not? I would not require it because you're just charging for more use. And if you're using more, then you just charge more use. Separate water meter is that enormous cost. I think it is. I think it is. So I think that we need to look at connection fees and actual physical connection. Physical connection could be 50 grand tying into a sewer and water saddle, where connection fees right now are 12 and 12. It's 24, so it's 75 grand. Or is it just 5 and 5 or 2 and 2 and no saddling, which saves our city infrastructure and our streets?
But are you
so
talking-
those details need to be figured
Yeah,
out.
and some of
Are
this
you
is,
talking about, an attached unit or an incorporated
Detached.
Both.
inside an existing?
Both, either.
If it's incorporated, we're not going to be able to.
No.
It's eliminated, but
No.
even what's the difference if it's a detached?
Well, for one thing, it's, if we're talking about adding moderate housing, and it's on a lot with, we want to treat it as a moderate new house, a dwelling for another family, so we can get credit on our housing element. So wouldn't they need their own water meter?
Not necessarily. You could divide it any way you'd like to divide it. Some apartment buildings have one water meter and they just divide it out.
exactly, you
know?
can just, that's on a case-by-case.
Yeah.
And actually, Brenda is weighing in from Buellton tonight. She can't help herself. She says that the ADU can be a sub-meter, you can tie into the existing with a proportional cost. So we really are looking at it. I mean, in some ways, these are, it's easy to try to put a one size fits all on this, but they really are that typical annoying answer that we planners give. Is that once in a while it depends. Right. Depends on the size of the ADU. Depends on the run. Depends on what the existing. If there's something about the existing tie-ins that would not accommodate the capacity for something that large, should we allow it?
So again, my comments, and I'm really done, is just to be as detailed as we possibly can. I mean, we could come up with 30 things, but I mean, we're way in front of the game here. There's just a lot of detail from Public Works that needs to chime in on it, but I think the state basically rules, and we're just doing detail.
And let's just, yeah, and yes, that's a whole other story.
Like a lot of stuff. So much of what we do now is state mandated and passed on through, and we don't have a lot of choice.
Well, that's one of my bigger challenges in my role is to try to figure out what the state is mandating. Is it funded or unfunded? How do we translate that into what we all are expecting and
where the burden
want to
lies.
live with? So we are right in the middle of the stream, I'd say. If you look online and how many people have submitted an ADU ordinance, some have had to go back and revise it because the state is tweaking requirements. So we're not behind in terms of bringing an ADU ordinance into our Muni code. We're just working on some of the details, make sure we get it right.
I just have two, maybe one's a stupid question, but why, if the existing structure does not have fire sprinklers, the other one doesn't? I don't understand.
State law said it.
It just doesn't make sense.
They really don't want us to add a
burden.
fire sprinkler as a burden to decrease the number of units built.
It's great. You double the risk.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you've done,
Right.
right, yeah, sort of.
And also, why wouldn't BAR get involved in something like this?
Well, BAR doesn't get involved in a lot of design residential at this point. There's a very small, if you look at their map, there's a very small area, which
Yeah,
in
right.
some ways is a little peculiar, but there are some single-family residentials that fall under the BAR's map of
Right,
authority,
right.
but they don't usually. So where does that leave us with design guidelines and with proportionality and with fitting in, to the neighborhood? It leaves that at the administrative level. That's just one of those issues where staff will be tasked with, we can't really do much with as-builts now. I mean, they're built, right?
And
but
it's
we can-
even one step further. The residential areas is this gray area where BAR comes and looks at it and says, I'd like you to do a steeper pitch roof, and the owner says, I don't want to, and they go, okay. They have no control over it. The only places that they've made that happen is in 3 developments, which is one behind Montecito Bank and Trust because it was an entrance, Skip Mesa only on the entrance, up on the top, and Nyborg on the edge, because you were coming into town. Other than that, all it is just, hey, we'd like you to do this, and you say, no thanks, and you don't have to do it.
Yeah.
So nobody has to do it for a house. You wouldn't have to do it for this, I would think.
Jack?
I had a couple of questions.
We just bored my wife and kid, too. Half the audience just left.
Well, they know what they're getting into then, right?
Back in March, April, May, and June, when
Right.
we're really going to put it down.
Right.
Pencil to paper.
They think they're bored now.
My questions have to do with the water, wastewater, and, it said in your staff report that we would exhaust our current capability in 4 to 10 years.
That's the kick. That's the biggest kicker in this whole thing.
Can we put some restriction in? And is
Well-
this an opportunity to restrict all construction?
Well, I think that the answer from HCD when we mentioned that, and we're not the only ones that are faced with potential constraints to build out, as we say. The answer from HCD was, well, if you constrain these, then you'll be constraining everything.
Yeah.
It has to be a moratorium on commercial and residential. That's a serious step for a city to take. You have to make sure that that you've run your numbers very carefully. And
Yes, that's what I'm asking.
If the numbers are there, the council could decide to restrain building. That has social and political ramifications. There's also legal aspects to it. The numbers would be basically, I'm going to give you an example. You can declare a water emergency. And there doesn't have to be a drought, because if your supply of water is nearing an end and build out would exceed your supply of water, regardless of how much rain falls, then you could put a moratorium
But the
on
point
anybody
is,
building.
It's on everything.
On
It can't
everything.
just be this
Exactly.
particular type
Then
of
it's that,
construction.
because then that's not a burden on ADUs.
Right.
That's just dealing with your water and your sewer capacity.
And that's for another day. I mean,
that is for another day.
Yeah.
And studies are going to be updated in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, that could be a little late if it's going to run out in 4. I mean, I agree with Jack. I think if it's going to run out in 4 years potentially, that could be a little late if we're updating 6 years from now.
Right.
So,
Well,
I'd-
that's a
Think
public
about-
works, city engineer, public works. That's a council priority that goes beyond. It dovetails with what we're talking about now. But if we're really in a situation where we think our water is we're facing a critical shortage, those are council tough council decisions to make.
And they won't be able to say, we're gonna
I won't be able to stop.
stop ADUs, but not all the other
No,
because
that's
of
not what I
this.
was saying.
Yeah, I
We should
understand.
do everything.
Yes.
Either do everything or
Daniel?
I think we discussed almost everything
Yeah.
possible.
Back to Gay?
Planned unit development, planned residential development. There is a zone, there's a, no, actually, we don't have any, I don't believe. Yeah, we have commercial condos, but it's a condominium style development in other cities that I've worked in. I haven't seen them here. Yeah, it's somewhat like a town. It is in our zoning ordinance. It's just not actually on the map. So someone could apply for it. So.
And I have a question. You mentioned parking. I know that we can't put restrictions and all, but is it possible for a city like ours, sorry, keep forgetting that, to say that there has to be off-street parking when there's no sidewalks? Because on my street, we now have a second residential unit in a house across the street. There's 2 rows of stacked parking in the driveway and on the weekends, and 2 or 3 cars on the street. And all the pedestrians have to walk out into the street around the cars to be able to walk up the hill against traffic coming down. And I think that's dangerous. And the same thing would apply on the other side. So I don't know, it seems like, you shouldn't be able to just allow people to park on the street if it's going to be a danger to the people in the neighborhood.
So in other words,
They're walking.
you're recommending that if there are no existing sidewalks at the time that the accessory dwelling unit is approved,
Then they need to have
that there
off-street
there
parking.
would be a restriction on.
We wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to say the ADU has to have parking. You could, the rules don't say you can't forbid parking in certain areas. So if you had a safety reason for forbidding parking within the setback where there's no sidewalks for safety reasons, you could do that, but it wouldn't affect whether or not the ADU could get a permit.
As an example, yeah, down on my street, it's the street is narrow, and it's a fire lane, so you cannot park in the street. And the city determined it is a fire lane, no parking in there. So therefore, you must be off. That's where Roy's going out. Is he's saying there you can't do it on this any more than you can't just. I mean, if you have a house with, 5 kids and they each have cars, which I have lots of kids and lots of cars, it's a nightmare, and my neighbors, I'm sure, think
they
it's a
hate you.
nightmare, but they can't park in the street because it's a fire lane.
I've had one kid in 4 cars, so.
Right.
Have your kids destroy all their cars.
That's a city council.
At one point, we have to open this public discussion.
Did Daniel,
Just maybe able to recommend sidewalks. I mean, if there isn't, you know.
and
I'd rather recommend no parking.
there's a sidewalk
Just because the
master
sidewalks are
plan.
expensive.
There is a sidewalk master plan that I'm sure you're aware of. So that may happen.
Yeah, I had a second thought when I went through this, and that is that these units are supposed to encourage below-market rents. So how do we do that? I mean, what's to prevent somebody
We
from
don't.
putting
That's-
in an ADU and charging $10,000 a month?
You
That's a
cannot- you
fiction
cannot.
that the state passed. We don't have unless we want to adopt rent control,
we didn't adopt rent control.
and we didn't. So,
Statewide, yeah.
No, we did not.
yeah. And I do have an answer to Mr. Peterson's question about the shot clock, basically. And I believe it's permit. They've got to get, and we do have these times where it stops, and we take a timeout and the clock's not running. But I believe they have to get their permit within 120 days. But if they don't have adequate plans in, then,
It's on that.
yes.
So in looking at the,
Clarify that in the ordinance so that they know, everyone knows.
so in looking at these frequently asked questions that Brenda gave us, in the answers where it says, accessory dwelling units provide housing for family members, students, the elderly, in-home health care providers, the disabled, and others at below-market prices within existing neighborhoods. That's one. And then item 7, accessory dwelling units offer lower-cost housing to meet the needs of existing and future residents within existing neighborhoods.
Well, again, it's a market rate game. That, you know, if you have a 2-bedroom unit in town, it's going to command X number of dollars. If you have a 422 square foot dwelling in your backyard with gravel parking, and
It'll be less than that.
ideally should be less than that. That said,
That's their
no,
thinking.
that's
But-
their thinking.
Well,
It's-
Jack, take it one step further. It allows, of course it does, owner occupied, so the owner moves into the smaller unit
That was going to be
and
my
then
That's
rents
next
the
point.
big house for $10,000 a month.
And
It's
also
not doing
themselves.
anything, you're just making money at it, and it's duplexing. I mean,
But you provided housing for two, family units,
two
one or
wealthy
more.
people.
Right.
But that's okay, the
Wealthy
owner and the family who can afford $10,000 a month rent. I mean, there's no way to
It doesn't
plug all
fulfill
those
the
holes.
requirements that the
Agreed.
state is saying.
Agreed.
It will not.
Agreed.
It's wonderful, but it doesn't
Yeah,
work that way.
and it's not a requirement, it's just that they posit a result that they may occur
May or may not
as
occur.
the justification for passing the ordinance.
And they're allowing us to
statute.
count them at this point to meet our RENA numbers. So whether or not it's a fiction, or if it's real, or it's,
That's their thinking.
we will be allowed to view this as an alternative means of housing to provide for a greater variety of income levels, which at this point, I think we're all pretty aware that most of the single-family residential that gets built at this point is market rate. It's not.
There was another
see that
objective. Yeah, there was another objective here, too. It says it increases our ability in the state to build green infill consistent with state greenhouse gas reduction goals. We don't have anything in our building code that requires that, do we?
We have the we have the green code, and that means,
it
for
optional? Is
newer construction, it's held to a higher standard than houses built 30 years ago. So by inference,
Well, and
your
they're,
windows
and
will be tighter.
they're suggesting that if you have increased density, you're going to have less driving. Because if you have people living way far apart and they all got to drive to the grocery store, they're driving greater distances. Therefore, by increasing density, we have now cut down on smog and therefore fulfilled the green.
And you're allegedly taking that public transit.
And I hate to
with
sound
this-
this cynical.
within
I'm left
1/2
of Bernie in
mile.
my personal politics, but
There's that.
this is how it works. It's
That's
just,
how it works. That's all right.
Okay.
I know.
Okay, let's open a public discussion. Like to speak? Come forward, state your name. I know, a whole hour, actually longer than that.
Here.
Oh, goodness. I'm Susan Bott, and tonight I'm speaking for We Watch. Nancy Emerson could be here, and so I will be speaking in her place. First, we want to thank Holly Owens for a fine and very thorough memo about the issue of accessory dwelling units in Solvang. It gives one a good understanding of the state framework within which local government must operate when developing this ordinance. To the ordinance, where the notation is TBD, these are our suggestions regarding setbacks. We would encourage you to add any setbacks which are allowed by the state, for example, the setback used by San Luis Obispo. About lot size, we would say use the earlier ordinance's lot size requirements. Regarding maximum size, adopt San Luis Obispo's requirements. Regarding maximum height, make it as low as possible to minimize the mass of the building and protect the neighbor's privacy and views. And about design guidelines, we would use the language that combines, quote, matching architecture, unquote, with San Luis Obispo's requirement regarding compatibility with the primary residence. And zones allowed, all residential zones seem okay to us. Secondly, issues of concern raised in the staff memo are water supply, regional housing, need allocation, owner occupancy, parking, and fees. It sounds like we need to balance regional housing need allocations and other new construction with the water supply. Do we need to make this housing a water priority, given the need for it? We strongly support you in incorporating language that will prevent ADUs being used as vacation rentals. Owner occupancy may or may not be the answer. We need affordable, low and moderate rental housing, and we don't need neighbors having to use the complaint process to deal with problems. Parking, given the state restrictions on regulation, is tough. We encourage you to require off-street parking when the primary structure is being converted if possible. Are there any other opportunities to require it? We already have a lot of on-street parking in residential areas by both tourists and residents. One way of looking at fees is to consider what it would cost the city to build affordable housing itself. It may be that subsidizing fees is a good trade-off. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nancy.
Susan?
Susan, my apologies, Ms. Bott. Okay, anybody else care to speak about this in public? At this time, we'll close it to public discussion. There's nothing to vote on here. We just take it back to, how do we phrase this, Holly?
To staff for consideration and further recommendation, and we will definitely be bringing forward a draft ordinance to the Planning Commission, who is seated at the time, which I'm planning it would be in February.
Okay.
We'll see if
Just
we can
one
get there.
last comment I have is echoing last speaker, Ms. Bond. I would agree that the San Luis one is awfully good. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it kind of, you guys looked at it, I assume, and kind of mirrored a lot of that with height
Right.
and setbacks and
Right.
things like that.
Well,
But
you
there's
looked
just
at
a whole
Healdsburg too,
lot
right?
that we just can't do.
Yeah, we've looked at Healdsburg. Healdsburg has a little bit of a different situation. They didn't go so much for owner occupied. They have a lot of vacation rentals up there already, and they
Well,
don't
and we
seem to
already
be-
have a vacation rental ordinance
We
that
do.
doesn't allow single-family residences, I mean, any residence to be vacation rental, and it is done on a complaint basis, but these would obviously fall into that category. Again, it's an enforcement thing, but it would be illegal.
Exactly.
Okay. Any of
No.
the planning commissioners' comments?
Yes, I do. I think that since we are essentially well, we talked about this in May. Our recommendation was we try to stick with as much of our second residence ordinance, 11-12-4, as we could. And things like the staff recommendation that we allow up to 1,200 square feet for the second residence, that's outside of the size that we allowed in our own ordinance. And I would definitely like to keep those size requirements, lot size and maximum size, and setbacks, the same as they are in our existing ordinance. I think they may even be better than San Luis Obispo in one or two cases here. I don't like the 50% of requirement, because that could be pretty big. It needs to have a ceiling on it, and I think 1,200 square feet is too big. That's my input.
Anybody else? Jack?
I think we need to look carefully at things like Gay suggested. And also, I like this summary that Ms. Spot did. That I think it did a nice summary of what we've talked about here. So it's something you might want to look at.
It's always good to get something in writing, especially from the public, so we can refer to it later and use that as part of our overall assessment of where we need to go from here. We certainly have been tasked by HCD to allow these wherever possible, and my biggest concern would be neighborhood compatibility, proportionality, appropriate connection fees. And then a lot of it is out of our purview, too. So with that we want to get the best product that keeps our neighborhood housing stock as solid and as consistent as possible, all the while allowing for this use where it's appropriate.
Okay.
So.
Were those the planning director's comments?
That is it. I will say, though, I have a little speech to read, just for you all, because I know it's your last meeting.
Possibly.
Possibly.
No, it's my last meeting.
It could be none of your last meeting. You could all be here again. But
It's true.
with that, I do want to thank you all for your support over the last couple of years. We have gone through some changes here. I know there's supposedly a Chinese saying that says, "May we live in interesting times." Yes, it's a curse and a saying. I will say that, from staff's perspective, we are facing a lot of changes here, especially with the city manager retiring, as well as with a new council, and it always brings unknown issues up. And planning deals with unknown issues all the time. That and unintended consequences of where we have best intentions, and then there's the results. Maybe sometimes months or maybe years later. So I do want to thank you all personally for the time that you have spent deliberating. Some of these have not been easy issues. Some of these are politically charged. But I think we've all done very well in that regard, and it's a small world, so I know we'll be seeing each other.
Thank you.
Future. Right.
And my last comment is, I know this is mine, so I've appreciated working with all of you. Thank you very much. If we could all look at the camera and wish Brenda a speedy get well, because I know that she's watching, so get well, Brenda, and take
She's
care.
very
We'll see you soon.
disappointed. This was going to be her debut. She was set for it.
Well,
and
this will be revisited.
She's
So
been
we'll be
texting
seeing
me
you
the entire
again.
time, reminding me to bring up things. So,
Got it.
so
Anything else? At
you'll
this
see
point,
her
we'll just-
enthusiasm again.
Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Holly, thank
Yes.
you for all your
Yes.
efforts.